That's a question that's really appropriate for me because I was engaged my senior year to somebody who was in Vietnam. He started out with us at Macalester and made it his freshman and sophomore year. And after his sophomore year, was told, you don't really have the grade point average to stay here. So he was drafted instantly. And much to everyone's dismay, mine, and went for basic training and all that my junior year. He was gone. And my senior year, while I was here living off campus, student teaching, he was in Vietnam. And so at night I would watch the news and think, well, he was in Saigon for part of the time, and then he was in Nha Trang. And he used to go in helicopters a lot from one place to another. So I kind of tried to listen to, and then I just thought that's hopeless. But our only way of communicating was letters. And so I would go down to the mailroom and get my letter that probably was sent 2 weeks earlier. And he would say, this is what's happening now. But when I was reading the letter, I have no idea where he is now, or if he is now, or whatever. So it had a huge, my first years at Macalester were great fun. I lived in the dorm, I did this. The junior year wasn't so bad. He wasn't here, but the senior year, not so great. So that's my Vietnam connection to Macalester.
I think that most of us had someone involved, but as women, we didn't have the same pressures as men. My brother was drafted as soon as he graduated from Macalester, was in an accident, so never was sent overseas. But I think for all of us, Vietnam was the crisis of our decade in international relations, and it taught us a lot about whether the US could be the policeman of the world, whether we needed to save face and not pull out. When I read my journal and see things I was saying back then, I was very young. I had just left high school. And I can't believe that I actually sometimes took a middle road, sort of trying to understand what was going on. But at the end of the day, we all knew there were problems like Agent Orange and so on. And I would just like to say that probably for me, because I wasn't so intimately involved as you were, maybe the huge issue of the decade for me was more civil rights and other kinds of internationalism, because I worked as an Arabist later in the Middle East, but I don't want to get ahead of the debate.
The Vietnam War was so present in our living rooms, so much more than the current wars have ever been on our TV news. It was really in your face. And I was engaged my senior year to someone a year ahead of me at Mac, who was in graduate school at the University of Chicago, Judy Kim. And we got married a couple weeks after graduation, and we went on a honeymoon, and we came back from our honeymoon, and he had been now was 1A because they had just gotten rid of graduate school deferments. He had one more year of graduate school. And we were hustling what we were going to do. I didn't want him to go to Vietnam. He didn't want to go to Vietnam. He went to, he was in graduate school at the University of Chicago, and it turned out that they had an exchange program with a graduate business school in Louvain, Belgium, or Leuven. It was a French-Flemish town. Excuse me. And he got accepted into this program, and everybody else who got accepted into the program was also escaping Vietnam. He went to his draft board and said, I have this opportunity to spend a year studying in Belgium, and the draft board said, okay, we'll defer you for another year. So we went to Belgium, legally escaping the draft, but that's why we were there. And then while we were there, the lottery came into place, and his number was 300 and something. And so in May or June of '69, we came back. My father was furious that we were legally escaping the draft. That was a very unpatriotic thing to do. His parents thought it was just fine. But it changed the trajectory of our life, certainly. And we had a wonderful time in Belgium. And I look back and I think, I don't know how we did it. Like, we bought a Volkswagen. I have no idea how we had enough money to buy a Volkswagen. Really, I don't know how we did that, but we did. And we came back and it was all gone. And he was safe from the draft, and he went to work full time and finished his graduate business program at night. And then
The good news, and I'll just to finish off my story, my husband, his name was Josh Bonner, and he was in our freshman class, but since he had flunked out and then he went to Vietnam, the good news, the thing that's happy about Macalester is after Vietnam, he called Dorothy Grinnell, I think was her, the registrar, and he said, please, 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 I know I didn't do well my first 2 years, but I can do it now. I really can. And they let him back in the English department. He had straight A's. He went on to get his PhD in English at Indiana University. He survived Vietnam.
My story is very short. I think I was the protester on the corners of Grand Avenue, standing still with my friends who were trying to protest that killing our fellow students and people who had gone before us. I was aware that people who had graduated before were being shot or were being killed. And it was important to me to just spend an hour or two every day at the corner just to be noticed that we are protesting this war, that for me killing was wrong, it wasn't right. But after I was married, we had to fight it, and my husband at the time was finishing his PhD and his deferment was running out. His local draft board was trying very hard to catch him, and he fought it off until he turned 26 and got away with it. But he was ready to go to Canada. We were ready to go to Canada. There was no way we were going to go be engaged in killing and being killed. But the protest was more significant afterwards to me.
Well, and I was in something I called in my journal Peace Vigils. I don't know if I was on Grand or not. And I remember writing in my journal, I'm standing here watching people run by me to their life's concerns. And I wrote something very philosophic about, if you're always running after your life's concerns, will you be able to hold to your principles? But that was me being a really nerdy idealist, writing sort of soppy language.
What you were thinking.
I was thinking, but the real issues were people who were burning their draft cards, returning them, and so on, and who were speaking out in other places. We were still just sort of practicing on the playground of Macalester, but I think it prepared us. It was stage one. I mean, I just come from living with my parents who were very conservative in South Dakota, just in a peace vigil. They were all for it, but that was a big step for me.
And I was part of some of those peace vigils too, but I was also, my senior year, I was student teaching in the fall and in this interim, and then I actually graduated early and went to a full-time teaching job. So I wasn't around as much my senior year to be part of that.
In a very strange way, it was race things that brought me to very white, at that point, Minnesota. I had grown up in a completely white high school in the suburban Kansas City area, and had tried during that time to arrange exchange programs with predominantly African American schools in that area as well. Had been completely outmaneuvered by the principal. But when the Macalester recruiter came to my high school and talked to the guidance counselor, he described an exchange program that Macalester had at that point with the traditional black college. And my high school counselor knew me well and called me out of my English class, and I came up and eventually decided to go to Macalester instead of where I had thought I was going. I remember the conversation I had with Dean Kramer, the dean of students, that spring of my freshman year, and Martin Luther King at that point was in Selma, and I had heard about a bus that was going down from the University of Minnesota, and so I said, Dean Kramer, I'm going on that bus, just to let you know I'm not going to be in classes for a few days, so He said, "Do your parents know?" And I said, "Yeah, they do." And so it was that race thing. I did not end up going to I did go to Selma, got a really great sunburn after a Minnesota winter. Alabama springs are pretty sunny. Did not end up going to Knoxville College, which I believe no longer exists now, or if they do, they're sort of limping. But ended instead talking to Dorothy Grinnell, the registrar at Macalester, about arranging a kind of unusual sophomore year abroad at what is now the University of Kinshasa in the Congo. And this is interesting because I had not known that about UN Louvain. The school was then called Lovanium, which was a daughter institution of Louvain. And that is why Dorothy Grinnell was very pleased to say I could get full credit for studying in my year in Africa. I came back and race things were kind of different. I think one of the really good things about that is that a lot of the leadership at all levels of the civil rights movement had become much more African American. So white participation was less critical, but boy, Vietnam sure had heated up. And we had the Thursday vigils at noon on Grand Avenue, and waved at the cars and waved at the single fingers that sometimes greeted us going by. There were big demonstrations those last 2 years at Macalester, 66 to 68, in both DC and in New York City. And we would get a kind of car called drive-away cars. People would pay to have their cars transported. And, if you had a valid driver's license and not a criminal record or so forth, you could use those cars for free to get one way and then maybe get another one to come back. And so we did that. We drove, straight through to DC. March on the Pentagon was one, and so forth. I was lucky about the draft because I knew already by the time I was 16 at least that I was a pacifist. And so when I initially registered for the draft, I registered as a conscientious objector. I asked for all the forms that they wanted by number. I had the handbook for conscientious objectors pretty much memorized at that point. And my draft board made a mistake, which was really great for me. They gave me my very first classification as a 1-0. And a 1-0 classification was a draftable conscientious objector classification where you would be drafted not into the military, but into alternative service. They should have given me a high school deferment, and they never did. So when I went to Africa and then I came back for my junior year, they said, "We're drafting you now, and you've got a 1A." And I said, wait a minute. I was in school all last year. How can you do that? Well, nobody sent us records. So I said, I'll take care of that, But besides, you can't give me a 1A because you've already given me a 1-0, And eventually, that is exactly what we went back to. I had my college deferment until I graduated. I ended up going back to the Congo, teaching a year there, teaching 2 years in Togo in West Africa, and escaped the draft. I had a hierarchy in my mind at that point. I believed then and believe now that killing people in war is evil. I still believe that. I thank teachers for their service, but not people who kill, frankly. But I admired the people who went to jail more than the position that I took. I felt like because of my privilege, I was getting off pretty easy, and I did. I got to teach. I didn't make any money, but it was a situation where I could avoid killing people and follow my principles. But I admired the people who went to jail more than me. I was not a draft card burner. I still have those 2 parts of my draft card around someplace. So